Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. This one I'm going to talk about The Promise, which of course is the first Avatar comic that was released. And I think what really inspired me to do this was kind of taking a look back at the search last week and then realizing that I kind of have to talk about The Promise as well. Another reason is that because I obviously have a copy from when the book first came out, and if you look on the section where it says first published, it says January 2012, and then you look back and realize that yeah, the book came out basically 7 years ago. That's how kind of old this series is. As the Lost Adventures was of course the first Avatar comic, but this is the first full series that's actually really expanding the universe of Avatar, and it is 6 years old depending on the part. And I still think, looking back, it remains one of the better Avatar comics, and especially compared to some of the stuff we're getting recently, I think it really stands out for how good it is, how eventful it is, how much is going on in this book. And it's always a weird one for me when I see people, I suppose other people recommend the comics to each other, and a lot of the times there is a sense of just skip The Promise, go straight into the Search, then the Rift, and stuff like that, that for some reason there tends to be a kind of weakness in a way associated with this comic, that it's not the go-to as the first one, even though it is the first comic. I've always kind of disagreed with that because I've always liked The Promise, but I think as time has gone on and we've got the start of Korra comics and some of the more recent comics haven't been as impactful, I've always looked back on The Promise and felt that, this deserves kind of better treatment than it usually gets from, I think, a decent amount of people out there. So in this video, I just kind of want to go back and point out I suppose, how much happens in The Promise and how kind of good it is. I think the last time I talked about The Promise, just on its own, was probably in or around 2 years ago. I think when I did my kind of in-review series going back through all of the comics. This probably won't be as in-depth in that, but it's just to kind of point out sort of how eventful this is compared to, I suppose, how uneventful some of the more recent comics are. And especially comparing this as the first Avatar comic to the first Korra comic, Turf Wars, there's such a difference between them in that, okay, yes, Korra is different than Avatar, Turf Wars is a different story than The Promise, but they take a similar approach in terms of they are both the first comic series from their series, and they take the approach of not going straight into the most important story that's at play. They both follow up their respective animated series, but The Promise doesn't immediately go for Zuko's mom. It leaves that for the second book. Similarly, the Turf Wars doesn't immediately go towards resolving Kuvira. Instead, it goes down its path of the Triad story that it has. And the difference that is at play here, from somewhat similar setups of just, both avatars in a way restoring peace where there was a conflict, and The Promise does it, I think, so well in terms of giving character arcs for Aang and Zuko at the forefront of the story, but also King Kwai is heavily involved in that as the kind of third notable leader. Katara plays a very important role throughout all of The Promise, just I think giving Aang especially a very different perspective on things and being more kind of open to the rest of the world. And then there is that side plot going on with Toph in the background with her metal bending school, given that that's the introduction of it here. And I think it's fair to say that Sokka probably plays his biggest role in any of the comics here, with the support role he plays to Toph in that, plus the fact that Suki comes in a little later on, and she reunites with Sokka there, and you get to see some of their interactions. And so it feels like Sokka's kind of best book. He has moments in the other books, but it feels kind of one of the better kind of placements of him here, whereas other books at times he's there because he's part of the group and he's not really doing a lot. They're just using him for the comedy and maybe a little bit of the kind of planning / inventor kind of side that he has. So I feel like this book uses its characters probably the best of, in a way, most of the comics. It actually manages to balance it out really well. Even in the past, I'd often say that Promise Part 2 is kind of weak because it focuses too much on the side story. But then when there's some of the books that come out and they struggle to even have a side story that you care about, let alone a good main plot. You have to praise this book for actually having a very solid side story with the Toph her metal bending school, Master Kunio as the kind of other guy coming in there, and their kind of fight for who gets to kind of control this dojo. And then like there's little important reveals along the way there of like that Kunio used to be one of Azula, used to train Azula, and the reason he's in this sort of odd position of being kind of almost like a karate instructor type firebending teacher is because, of course, Azula kind of kicked him out, basically. That's just a nice little explanation for a kind of newly introduced character who makes a lot of sense and fits in line with everything else going on. Not to mention, this book acts as a setup for the search with the introduction of Azula right at the end. Because of where the development for Aang and Zuko go, that's what kind of sends that going off. Similarly, like I suppose the setup for Azula / Ozai is here as well, in that that's another aspect of this book that I think is kind of needed here, and that I think you kind of need to read this book to get the Ozai stuff from here, to give more context to the Ozai that you see in The Search, and again in Smoke and Shadow. So I think there's just kind of, in a way, almost like no reason to really tell people to skip past this book, because there is so much going on with it. Like I don't get why it's regarded as a book that, you know, it's one of the weaker comics. I don't get why it's sort of regarded as like a skippable one. I think it's arguably one of the most important comics because of what it does with introducing Yu Dao, which is a kind of early attempt at Republic City. It also, the idea is that it eventually sort of, you know, kind of becomes like part of that as well. That still, I suppose, needs to be fully explained, but like as the idea for what we're now getting with Cranefish Town in the more recent comics, we're seeing this as the sort of test bed for what's going to become Republic City, and it starts all of that. It starts the whole idea of the world changing from being very set in stone, the nations are the nations, and transferring that into, no, there's a lot more blending of the nations now, with Yu Dao being Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom, and then the transition from Cranefish Town basically becoming Fire, Earth, and Water Tribe, and obviously the return of Air Nomad stuff, which this book also sets up with Avatar, with Aang's fan club basically becoming what is eventually going to become the Air Acolytes, as we see kind of towards the end of this book and in the books after this. And there's still other stuff going on, like Kori Morishita as like a kind of new character introduced in this book to give the more personal side of the issues going on in Yu Dao, is actually one of the better newly introduced characters from the book as well. So, and then they used like other minor characters very well as well. That you have Sneers is in this book for a little bit, Longshot's in it, and you get a little bit on their relationship. Kori is in a relationship with Sneers, and Sneers was just a non-character basically in the show, but now you actually get to see a little bit of him. He's not a hugely important character, but it does a good job at giving him a character, putting him in a relationship, and kind of adding something, you know, new and different to the book as well. It's also where like Iroh kind of comes in at the end as well, so they use a lot of characters are used over the course of The Promise, and I think it's really well done. I think reading it again, it's like, I really don't see where so many of the kind of problems with this book kind of come in, and would absolutely kind of be like, read the Promise. Like, I think some of the more common criticisms that the book tends to get are minor in the grand scheme of things. The whole, you know, Aang and Katara calling each other sweetie. Like, again, that only applies to scenes where they're more, you know, Katang relationship scenes, which of course they're going to go for here because it's the first book after they've become a couple. So you get a lot of that, but I don't think it takes anything away from some very strong Aang and Katara scenes, as she has to really kind of support Aang in the decisions that he's kind of asked to make as the Avatar, including being a key part of the reason why he accepts Zuko's kind of idea of, if I ever go bad, I need you to end me. And Aang is really struggling over this decision, and he eventually agrees to it reluctantly because he looks to Katara and she nods and says, do this. And similarly, like, because she also plays the role of kind of presenting a positive side for, look at what is happening in this city. So she acts as both the person who sort of opens Aang's eyes to that possibility of the nations not being as, you know, the borders not being as important of a thing anymore, both to Aang but also to King Kuei, who also, you know, he was characterized in the show, and they used that characterization and the position that he's in to give him an extra arc here of, he too, even though he's much older than Aang and Zuko, is an inexperienced leader because of what was going on in Ba Sing Se. So here is him as leader trying to, for the first time, assert his kind of power as leader, and he's going overboard with it, whereas he should be a bit more kind of reasonable in this situation. And then along the way, like, this is Aang, who is, you know, like, at this point, like, he's what, 14, just about 14, very early in the comics. He is super young to be making a lot of these decisions, but because of everything he's been through, you know, you have to give him some respect in that role. And then Zuko, of course, is struggling the entire time throughout this book with his decision making, which has always been his flaw. And he decides to go to Ozai over this. And I like how they set that up of using the whole "Where's my mother" scene from the end of Avatar, adding on to that, and basically Ozai planting the seed within Zuko of, you are going to struggle as leader, you will need to see me again. And Zuko eventually going back there because Iroh is kind of off doing his own thing with his tea shop. He's not immediately there anymore as the immediate mentor to Zuko. So I think the setup for that is very well done. And, you know, I suppose we'll start with the Zuko in terms of some more analysis here. So very early on in the book, we get the scene of him asking Aang to make him the promise. What is the title of this book, The Promise? What is the promise? Zuko says, even now, after everything that's happened, my family's legacy is still a part of me. That's why it's my duty to heal the scars that the Fire Nation has left on the world. But the Fire Lord's throne comes with a lot of pressures. And if I'm honest with myself, I need a safety net. The world needs a safety net. That's what I need you to be, Aang, the safety net. And he says, as your friend, I'm asking you, if you ever see me go bad, end me. Promise me, Aang. And Aang agrees to this after, you know, the little scene of, as you can see there, Katara kind of urging Aang to go ahead with this, even though he really doesn't want to. And how this also plays into Aang's characterization over the course of this book of, as an airbender, he doesn't want to kill anyone. He managed to defeat the Fire Lord without having to kill him. He hasn't had to kill anyone over this. So he's been able to keep his, you know, personal kind of morals correct while still being the Avatar, which has kind of been a struggle for other avatars in the past. And so I think it's just an amazing setup for two arcs in all of this. Zuko's doubts over if he's going to able to remain the person that he's grown into over the course of the series. And then him putting a lot of that pressure onto Aang here, and Aang suddenly having to once again deal with that pressure of, do I kill someone? I'm ultimately agreeing to this because he's my friend, and I agree I don't want to see things go bad again for the fate of the world, but what are we doing here? He obviously goes to see Ozai, and Ozai says to him, the throne comes with many pressures, and those pressures will change you. But if you can't stand the heat, you'll become something more. But if you can stand the heat, you'll become something more. Of all the people in the world, I have the wisdom you need, the wisdom of experience. And be honest with yourself, Zuko. Do you really believe you can handle it all on your own? You'll be back and I'll be here waiting for you, son. So, great setup there using the kind of flashback to that scene of Where is my mother? Aang, of course, they do an interesting thing here where while Zuko goes to see Ozai for advice, Aang gets advice both from Katara but also from Roku. And you have this arc here which is great setup for what eventually happens in the Rift, I think it is. The Rift is where he reunites with Roku, yeah, because he has to properly connect with Yang Chen. And we get the whole idea of really great characterization for Roku here of him obviously feeling the pressure because he had to put all of this on Aang. His mistakes led to Aang being put under all of this pressure. And he's really pushing Aang to do everything that needs to be the case to sort of make amends for what he did. But he's coming from his perspective. The world during the period where he was in, where the borders were very set. And at the time, of course, maybe the world wasn't ready for it, but we're not just Aang's lifespan, like 16 years on or whatever, 14 years on. We're also an extra 100. So the world has changed a lot because of this. And Roku isn't really accounting for this when he's talking to Aang. So we get the whole idea over the course of this book of Roku being kind of set in the past, giving Aang this advice of the borders need to remain the same, the 4 nations remain 4, and you have to make up for what I did. And Aang eventually, over the course of all 3 of these books, coming to realize that that advice, while okay, is not what he needs right now, and he has to make these decisions on his own. As someone who's part of this new world, he has to be the one to make these decisions. And he decides to separate contact with Roku by the time it gets to part 3. I think I have the scene here. And he says, you know what I actually did see? Katara, Sokka, and Toph. I saw the Kyoshi warriors, the White Lotus Society, the monks who raised me, and I saw Zuko. I don't know how to contemplate the world without first thinking of the people I care about, including Zuko. Roku says, by refusing to take decisive action, you continue to put the world at risk. And Aang says, it's a new kind of world. There's no getting around risk. Avatar Roku, you've taught me so much. I couldn't have become the Avatar I am today without your wisdom, but everything's so different now. It's not like when you were alive. I have to figure this out on my own. And he says goodbye. And they show the symbolism of this, of him basically burning the fire pendant from his kind of avatar kind of necklace thing, as being him shutting off connection to Roku, who he feels doesn't really have the perspective to give him advice in this current era. For now, it's showing a sign of Aang being, I suppose, more independent. It later, becomes a thing where he does need the help of Roku again, and they sort of get past their issues. And it shows a moment of growth for Roku as well, because Roku suddenly is now asked to think about what Aang has just told him, and realizes that it is completely correct. And then what happens here, of course, it's one thing for Zuko to say, okay, if I go bad, kill me. But what actually causes Zuko to go bad enough in Aang's mind to have Aang actually consider killing him? And it's the approach that he takes when he sees, I suppose, what's happening in Yu Dao and the whole harmony restoration movement. And this is a very kind of political thing of like, Yu Dao is a part of the Earth Kingdom that is more or less controlled by the people from the Fire Nation. It is the first colony. It's the one that's been in existence since before the war officially started. This is part of the whole Roku's era of like one of the first places that Sozin actually went to sort of take over and improve with the wealth of the Fire Nation. So it's pre-war, and that's how long it's been in place. Because the war is now over, do you ruin all of that by taking the Fire Nation people out, sending them back home, and then potentially changing, I suppose, the dynamic of that place? Maybe because most of the wealthy people are the Fire Nation, maybe that becomes a very poor place in the aftermath of this. But at the same time, can they justify leaving it the way it is, leaving this kind of artifact of the war as is, and just accepting that, okay, it's not great, but we just have to let the Fire Nation keep that section of the Earth Kingdom? You could sort of see what the problem is in all of this. And Zuko's fighting for, like, no, the people should be able to stay there. My people live there happily. Whereas the Earth King is like, no, the war is over. The Fire Nation shouldn't be allowed to just, by default, remain part of the kingdom. And it's a very interesting conflict of, like, Ozai's influence on Zuko causes Zuko to kind of really double down on this. Now, ultimately, that's the correct approach that they take, that Aang eventually comes around to, Quay eventually comes around to as well, that because the world is moving towards a kind of more open kind of border kind of policy, this is the right way to go about it. So I think they do a really good job at actually handling a very complicated plot point very well in this book, of getting to a resolution with the Yu Dao kind of issue. And then, like, along the way you have really good moments, like when Aang first goes to see Zuko in the aftermath of him making the decision not to support the Harmony Restoration movement. Back in part 1, you have the great moment where like the guards basically go to like arrest Katara and Aang for like intruding, even though they're best friends, and eventually like Zuko gets angry at Katara for like defending herself from the guards, and he grabs Katara, and we see that this is what causes Aang to first get angry and consider like, has Zuko lost it? And you get the kind of initial kind of battle between Aang and Zuko, and they use the Avatar state really well over the course of this book, of just Zuko knows he can't handle Aang in the Avatar state, so there's this kind of fear that comes into play here. Katara ultimately calms Aang down in this situation, and I suppose leads to a moment of just showing the conflict here of like, you know, Zuko basically in the aftermath of this goes, okay, yeah, Katara's right, we both need to calm down. And Aang is just like, I came here to talk to you, you caused this. And there being this kind of clear frustration, as this is the point where Aang and Katara get the tour of Yu Dao, and this is where Katara really gets the idea of like, actually, is this what the future of the world is? And you come to the moment in part 3 where she kind of, you know, thinks to herself, you know, if the world has to remain separated, what does that mean for your and I relationship, Aang? And she thinks about the future at this point and sees, you know, their family, and basically asks him to really consider, like, I'll accept your decision once you've thought about it clearly, even if it means that we kind of have to not be together. It's a really interesting moment, and Aang ultimately realizes that the people in his life are kind of more important to him than, you know, the fate of the world, politics, and he'll do what he feels is best for the people of the world. And in this case, it is that the world is kind of moving towards the nations not meaning as much anymore. So, it leads to, I suppose, some really kind of, I think, you know, great moments of towards the end of, especially with King Kwai, even though he's not as much of a focus in the book as, say, like Aang and Zuko's arc, Katara ends up being the one who sort of really helps King Kwai to really see the issue at play here. Of like, she goes up to the kind of blimp that he's in and says, "You've never visited Yu Dao," and he says, "Up until a year ago, I'd never even visited my city's outer ring." And Katara says, "Then to you, Yu Dao has always just been a Fire Nation marker on an Earth Kingdom map. Let's get off this balloon, Your Majesty. You ought to meet the people who have to live with your decisions." And she brings him down into the middle of a war zone and allows him to see that, you know, it is people who he's dealing with here. And I suppose what he sees is a group of kind of very, like, diverse people. He's in the middle of all of this talking to a couple who is air nomad and water tribe, and looks back at a group of people who are like Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom, and they're just living their lives. And he realizes at this moment that he can't, just because we know Kwai is ultimately a good guy, that his want to be the powerful king and make strong decisions for his nation can't override the fact that he just feels, you know, that people should be allowed to live. Basically the same approach that Aang eventually gets. So I think they do that really well. And in the aftermath of this, like, Kwai doesn't really get much development going forward, because in a way he doesn't really need it. The development he gets here is meant to sort of be the thing that turns him into a solid leader at this point in time in the world. But when we get to the end of all of this, and Aang getting this close to killing Zuko, but in the end he actually, in the Avatar state, saves him when he separates Yu Dao from the surrounding area. We get to this moment right at the end, in Iroh's tea shop. It's the kind of debut of Iroh into the series. He walks in there, Zuko's there, and they have what for me is one of the best written scenes in all of the comics. Which section will I start with? So they mention the fact that they both have the same dream, which ends with Aang killing Zuko. But what he says here, I'll start here actually. Zuko says, "I was wrong to ask you for that promise, Aang. I've struggled for so long to do what's right, to even know what's right. Then, when the war ended, I thought the struggle had finally ended too. I thought I'd won for good. A visit to Ozine prison changed that. I realized the struggle was actually just beginning. I didn't think I could handle it, so I asked for your help. But asking you to end me if I went bad, that was just like asking you to figure out right and wrong for me. I didn't just want you as my safety net, I wanted you as my escape hatch. I can't put that on you. I understand the struggle isn't something a Fire Lord can escape. I'm sorry, Aang. And Aang says, you don't give yourself enough credit, Zuko. Deep down, you've always known what's right. I mean, you were right about Yu Dao. And, they discuss basically, the idea of like, so how did you feel when you were falling into the chasm that I made? And Zuko realized at this point that he knew Aang wouldn't let him die. And it's because that moment there was obviously Aang showing that he knows Zuko. That part of the reason he was unwilling to initially agree to the promise was that he knew Zuko wouldn't go bad because he understands him. And there's this moment here also kind of showing that Zuko understands Aang, and we'll get Aang here talking about his flaw. So Aang says, because I'm a flawed avatar, Roku told me you're his great-grandson. Since Roku's my past life, in a way you're my family, Zuko, and no matter how hard I've tried, I've never been able to detach myself from those sort of bonds. It's a flaw, I know, but one I've decided to accept for this life at least. Zuko says, you're not the one who's flawed, Aang. Why can't the struggle get easier for me, even just a little? Sometimes I wonder how long I'll last. And this is where he remembers his mother, and they set up the idea that for Zuko, the last step in, I suppose, him being like fully developed as a character, it's going to be fixing the big mystery in his life of like what's wrong with his mother, and that influence from the Roku side of his family tree being back in his life, being resolved, that might clear up the last bit of confusion left for him. And they both talk about how it's a new world, and Iroh just helps them to have a kind of peaceful, happy ending. And we end with, I suppose, some nice resolution with all of this of Zuko, going to see Azula and getting her involved in the search for his mother. And Aang, having been previously actually angry towards the end when he realized that at least one chapter of the fan club had maybe gone too far with their appreciation of his culture, he accepts them all in ultimately to be, the heir acolytes here as we get. And it's a nice one as well because you have that other very small subplot as well going on, that when Aang is with the fan club, you see Katara begin to get a little bit jealous because it's all girls in the fan club, initially at least. And she's getting jealous because he's getting all this female attention, and you think that she's going to get annoyed with Aang when he eventually kind of stops hanging around with them. But what Aang says in the aftermath of this, I think, is really, really well done. And he says, I know it's just a silly fan club, but for a moment there, it almost felt like I was at home again with my people. Thanks for agreeing to stay there for the night, sweetie. It meant the world to me. And this is coming after Katara has just said, well, you certainly seem to enjoy those girls' attention. And you suddenly see the shocked look on her face after Aang says what he just said there to her, of just like, what was I just about to do? Like, I completely misread that situation. And it's a moment where she realizes in a way that, like, has she been sort of caring enough about Aang's struggle with the fact that his people are gone? And he says, don't thank me, Aang, I don't deserve it. And so it's a really nice moment that right at the end, she's not like directly part of like the lessons that Aang is giving to the heir acolytes, but she is there in the scene in the back, kind of sort of listening in. So it's a nice little moment that fits kind of nicely in with what like Imbalance was starting to do with Air Temple Island. And maybe by the end of Imbalance, we can get some sort of a moment of maybe her suggesting that the heir acolytes kind of live there or something like that. So that's really nice. As for the side plot with Toph and her students, as I said before, I think it's actually pretty well done in that, like, the book kind of needed a side plot, just because I actually feel like The Promise does a really good job with its main plot of, for the most part, not needing a ton of extra development on things. So the side plot with Toph, I like the way it resolves because you see her being very harsh. That is she the best teacher? We saw that with the way she kind of handled Aang, and that it eventually came around, but like it still didn't come across that like Toph was the greatest of teachers. And now she's trying to teach people metal bending. And so she finds her first three students, Hotun, Penga, and the Dark One. And I think by like North and South, like their last appearance in the comics, they're all solid enough characters. I don't think they're in any way amazing, but depending on where they go with the future of the metal bending kind of school and how it links into metal bender police force, that could actually end up having some really nice payoff. But here as the key development for them in terms of, I suppose, Toph developing into a better teacher, having a better relationship with her students, I like what they do here, and it takes Sokka helping her to sort of resolve this. And she says, metal is just a part of Earth that's been purified and refined. But how does it become like that? By getting heated, melted, and pounded. By going through pressure and pain. I discovered metal bending in a tiny metal cell when Master Yu and Xinfu were taking me back to my parents. That whole trip, all I could think about was how my parents expected me to be something I'm not. Sure, they wanted me to be helpless, but they also wanted me to be cultured, well-mannered, soft-spoken little lady. All I felt was pressure and pain. When I brought Hota and Penga and the Dark One to this school, I expected them to become metal benders. I was going to make them tough enough to move the most stubborn part of the most stubborn element. I expected them to be something they're not. How is what I'm doing to them different from what my parents did to me? Maybe the Beifong Metal Bending Academy is just a way for me to pass all the pressure and pain to someone else. And Sokka says, no, that's not what this place is at all. And she decides at this point to say that she's going to sit down from the kind of battle of the dojos and basically, hand over, control to him, just kind of give up because it hasn't been a success for her. And the key thing in all of this is that the three students are just about to plan to kind of leave, and they overhear her saying this, and they see this, I suppose, different side to her they haven't really seen before, of being the more thoughtful, the kind of emotional side of Toph. And this is kind of what inspires them to, in the end, stand up for her, see that she had put a lot of, focus on that. Like, they get to know her personality, her backstory, through overhearing what she's saying to Sokka. So, that I think works really nicely. And it's not the most important plot, but because I think they made Master Kunio into someone who at least had a connection to other stuff, and the metal bending students learning metal bending in the heat of this kind of final battle worked really nicely. And then it sets up that, okay, that plot is over. Now Sokka and Toph can kind of rejoin the main story when the big battle is about to come between King Kuei and Zuko and their armies, basically. And that's when Suki arrives back in. And then you have all the other big plot points that happen here of Mei breaking up with Zuko in The Promised Part 2. The arrival of the Kyoshi warriors, like Ty Lee and Suki mainly, to be Zuko's bodyguards. That is a major plot point that happens in The Promised Part 1. Now, ultimately, now it's a little bit of a tired plot point, and we wish they'd kind of move Suki away, which maybe the imbalance will reveal that that's what's happening, because they already confirmed that she's... I suppose, no, she's in... I suppose they're basically going to reveal that maybe she already is away from doing that sort of thing. But we'll see where they go. But still, it was a notable plot point at the time. It was a way to, while things are more focused in or around this area, have Suki be part of the story. And she gets a chance to sort of move away from Zuko towards the end, reunite with Sokka, and it's Sokka, Toph, and Suki, like the airship team, reunited again in the middle of this big battle. And it works really, really well at the end. Equally, even the Oogies thing has a little bit of a plot arc to it. Sokka's the one always talking about Oogies when Katara and Aang are having kind of lovey-dovey moments in front of him. And what happens the second Suki arrives? He has an Oogies moment with her, and you realize the sort of hypocrite that he is. And I think it's Toph who's the one to kind of realize that. So, even some of these kind of moments that people were a little bit upset about, they still have nice resolutions in the end. And so, I'm not going to say it's a perfect comic, in that I probably would have preferred if the Toph stuff was a little bit more dispersed among Part 1 and 3, instead of being completely confined to Part 2. But looking back again, The Promise is a very, very strong book. And I would urge anyone who hasn't read it in a while to go back and read it and acknowledge that it's such an eventful book, and compared to Turf Wars especially, where there's very little going on, and even some of the more recent books like North and South and Imbalance Part 1, all the parts of The Promise have so much more going on than those books. And I wish we could sort of get back to this style of kind of content, in that they managed to make a story that wasn't the most obvious story to be told, you know, tackling post-ATLA, and turn it into a must-read story. In that they probably could have, if they wanted to, led with the Zuko's mom story, but instead they chose to have a story that was more about character development for so many characters, to set up more plot points going forward into the books. That, you know, if we just went with the search from the start, we'd then have to later set up Toph's metal bending school and all this other stuff. We'd have to later set up the whole Yu Dao thing, and that would have, I think, very much slowed down some of the other stuff that happens later on. So the fact that they led with some big world building moment plus character stuff laid the groundwork for, you know, the search to happen, because it got a little bit of setup with the introduction of Iroh towards the end here, and the introduction of Azula, you know, giving more context even just through the promise for why the search happens. And just, again, good use of all of the characters. And Sokka specifically is an example of a character who hasn't had a lot to do in the comics up to now. I think this is one of his best showings. So that's my thoughts on The Promise here. Just basically the discussion on why The Promise is so good and why you should go back to it and reread it again. And if you don't feel particularly strongly about the Promise and you haven't read it in a while, do that and I think reevaluate it in the context of some of the weaker, newer comics that we've got. So that's my discussion topic for this week. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on The Promise, looking back on it 7 years after it first came out. So that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.